Yeah, cool. How do we manage forms in Turbo? So this talk is going to be about doing forms in Turbo, but more broadly, it's about how do we approach solving front-end problems in Turbo. One thing I found as I've learned Turbo, as I've talked to other people that are learning Turbo, is that it's not always straightforward to go from like, here's the problem that I have on my front end. Where do I reach in this toolbox to find something to solve it? You go looking online and there's a whole bunch of options that all look really different to each other. They all seem kind of arbitrary, and it's just hard to draw a narrative between the problems that I have and what I'm going to use to solve it. So we're going to talk about that tonight with respect to forms, but I think it's really a more broadly useful concept. So let's do it. Let's start with a good old-fashioned form. This is JavaScript free with an asterisk. I've got my form over here in an iframe. We're going to keep iterating through this thing, through the slides. You might build it just like this. Bit of HTML, bit of ERB. You're having a good time. So I can fill up my form. I can make my profile in this fantastic website. I'm Matt Hood, by the way. See how I saved my introduction to filling out my profile? Yeah. You're about to find out. Oh yeah, it's not a mandatory field. It also doesn't have an exit button because it's been replaced by a share screen button. That's dive. I don't think I can get rid of this. We'll see what happens when I go to the next page. Damn it, Zoom. All right, and what the hell? Let's do my actual birthday. What could go wrong? I can create my It's gonna ruin my whole thing. Let's do that again. And it didn't go away. I think it's there for the long haul. Okay. All right. My name is Matt Hood. I work as a Rails dev. We do Hotwire at work. Yeah, let's go with that. My favorite color is blue. And you all should remember birthday. And hey, successfully created a profile for Matt Hood. It's a form. Does what you want. JavaScript free, bit of a lie. Because oh no. Real? Yeah, I'm still on the Zoom and it's still all plugged in.
Oh, maybe it's more yeah.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
She's gentle, bro.
There goes me trying to be dramatic, but in that moment, I got my exit button back, so I'm really happy about that. It was all for the best. Okay. So even though we had a page where we just did HTML, we just did ERB, there was still some JavaScript involved, and that JavaScript is called TurboDrive. This is kind of day one Hotwire stuff, but I think it's good to start from like a common reference point and to remind those who may be less familiar with Hotwire as to the mechanics. So in a page where Turbo is installed, Turbo is loaded, we're going to have our old page. We're going to click a button or submit a form, and we're going to do a navigation to a new page. But we're not just going to swap out the whole thing. We're not just going to throw the old page in the trash and bring in a new one. We're going to keep the same overall document. We're going to keep some state of the page. Turbo is going to look inside the head tags, check out your assets, check out your configuration in both the old one and the new one, and sort of mush them together. This is just so that you don't have any funny asset reloading stuff, any flashes of unstyled content or missing JavaScript for a little bit. And then what it's going to do is it's just going to pull out the visible stuff of your page. It's going to throw out the old visible stuff and replace it with the new visible stuff, but all your assets are going to stay in place, and it's just going to make navigations a little more smooth. It also chucks a little bit of a progress bar up the top, so that's kind of neat. I'm not sure how useful this will always be. I think browsers are getting better at handling things like asset caching, but for now and in the past, it just smooths up our navigations for free. And so when I submitted that form, we were getting still a little bit of smoothness, a little bit of interactivity from TurboDrive for free. But that's not always enough. Some of us have very short attention spans. Sometimes when you're filling out a form, you just need to sit down and lock in with some relaxing beats to keep you on track. All right. Now I feel like I can really fill in this form. So let's do it again. Let's say it's maybe Adam's filling this one in. Hash not Adam. Doesn't really make sense without the hash, does it? What's your favorite color, Adam?
It's blue, but probably not that blue. Maybe let's go cyan.
Yeah, that's so much better. And I'm gonna assume sort of circa
Very kind.
I don't want to put your birthday on the internet. All right. And I've already messed up my demo because I could do something like this, right? And validation error, and my music stopped. That's no good. I don't want that. All right, let's restart the music. I can't finish my form without my music. And then I'm gonna submit, and it's submitted, but my music stopped. I'm still disappointed as a user of this website. I really wanted the music to keep going. I wanted that continuity. And of course, lo-fi beats to relax/study to is a metaphor for other stuff that might be going on the page. Sometimes you don't want your interaction to mess up the whole page. And so it'd be nice if we had some tools to do that without having to tear it down and rebuild it all in React. And so we can use a thing called turbo frames to do that. Again, this is pretty basic Hotwire stuff. If you follow the Hotwire tutorial, this is something you'll be introduced to pretty quickly. But we can talk about it in comparison to Turbo Drive. This diagram gets a bit more complicated, but what we can take away is that we still have an old page and a new page. We had an old full HTML document rendered by Rails, and then Rails rendered a whole new page for us, and we want to smoothly go from the old one to the new one. It's still going to do a bit of introspection into the head tags, not as much, but it'll still check them and you can set things. That's not really important. It's not going to preserve your entire visible area. Sorry, it is going to preserve your entire visible area. What you can do is put this thing called a turbo frame. You're going to see it in action in a moment. Everything else outside of that turbo frame will be ignored. It will stay as what was present in the old page. This little dashed line is representing the new content that is being ignored because our old lo-fi beats are going to stick around across the navigation. All that's going to happen is we're going to take out anything that was inside that turbo frame. We're going to remove it, and we're going to look to that same turbo frame in the new page and swap it in. And if we play our cards right, that should keep our lo-fi beats to relax/study to going, and I might have a chance at finishing this form with my intention intact. So what that looks like in a Rails app is wrapping your content in a turbo frame tag with some kind of unique ID. That's what's going to let it line it up between the old page and the new page. And so you can see with this dashed line, that's where I've put my turbo frame. And so now I can start my lo-fi beats to relax/study to. I can get all the validation errors in the world, and the rest of my page stays intact. And that's lovely. Hey, Justin. Favorite color? I somehow I knew you were gonna say that. I don't know why.
It's a color.
Justin's really wise, so I'm gonna assume. This is cool. So beats are still playing. I can submit it. We successfully created a profile for Justin Tan, and I've still got the music. Thank you. Thanks. Again, day one Hotwire stuff. This is all in tutorial, but wanted to start with common ground because I love turbo frames. I think they're so good. There are things other than turbo like unpoly and HTMX that are JavaScript libraries that occupy a similar niche, but none of them I think have this really clean, tight workflow of a turbo frame. And just to see how clean this is, I want to pull open the dev tools and show you what a turbo frame actually looks like in the DOM for those that haven't sort of gone super deep into this. So we're within my iframe. I'm going to go within this div, and it's literally just a HTML tag implemented as a custom element. But this Rails helper is just becoming a HTML tag called turbo frame with an ID, in this case, of new profile frame. So I think that's really cool. It's such a small way to achieve a lot of interactivity. And what I want from any solution that involves turbo to doing some front end reactivity is to be able to stay with that foundation of just a nice turbo frame and to layer on any little bit of interactivity beyond that I need. So let's see what that looks like as we keep going, as we keep trying to add things to our form. You know, you know. Yeah, there's several GitHub issues on the Turbo repository of people complaining about this and speculating about different solutions. There are lots. I'm going to give you mine. I might agree, you might not if you have opinions about this sort of thing. But let's talk about the problem of redirects. Maybe I'll demonstrate it first. Let's say I'm filling out my form. I've got my lo-fi beats. Yeah, Andrew gets a turn. Yeah. What's this? Isn't this your website? Yeah. Favorite color?
Yellow.
That's such an awful yellow. What do we want? I mean, Andrew's my boss.
How far back can you go?
Yeah. Maybe let's find out. Let's. Dang it. All right. Content missing. That doesn't look like what I had over here. This is what I wanted to redirect to. I wanted the show page for my profile. It's classic MVC Rails. And instead I got content missing. If we look in the console, we can get a bit more of a clue as to why this is. Now, the rest of this red and yellow is from the iframe. I'm not responsible for the carnage in this console. But right here, is that big enough? Maybe I can zoom in a little bit. The response did not contain the expected turbo frame and will be ignored. It didn't love it. And so the reason for that is that our response did not contain a turbo frame. It's looking from the old page. It's trying to find that same turbo frame in the new page so it can pull the old one out and swap the new one in. That doesn't work very well with a redirect to an entirely new page. So we need something else. Turbo frames are clearly alone not going to cut it here. I would have liked to get some continuity in the lo-fi beats, but I guess it makes sense. The next step, whenever turbo frames are not enough, is turbo streams. And turbo streams get complicated quick. And there's so many different ways you could use it because like it really is a power tool. There's also a lot of different explanations for what it is. And I really do think of it as a way to write JavaScript in HTML, which does not sound like a sales pitch. But it really is a way of just having some HTML in a certain format and having some JavaScript get executed on the client. There's a lot of implications of that. That's the basic mechanic that's going on underneath. And I think that's a subtle point that can escape you for a large part of the initial journey of using Turbo. We can see this happen in a few ways. You can literally just stick this HTML somewhere on the DOM as part of your initial page load, and Turbo Streams, the JavaScript library, will take care of turning it into this. You can send this content back as a response from any controller, and Turbo will just execute it on the page. You can even set up a WebSocket connection to your server from the client, and unprompted from some other external event, just send through this Turbo stream data at any time, and then Turbo will execute it. And so if we take it back to this form redirect issue, the dominant advice among the million ways to handle it I see is to forget about your turbo frame around the form. Every time you get a validation error, use a turbo stream to target an ID you have to know you need to set on the form. Swap it out using a turbo frame with action replace every time you get a validation error. And then because you don't have a turbo frame scoping your navigations, then you can just redirect like normal. Don't worry about remembering that explanation because it's not my favorite one. Why I don't like this is because most of the user experience we want is the same. We want to hit validation errors and have lo-fi beats keep playing. We just want a slightly different outcome. Instead of redirecting to the same page, we want to redirect to a different page. And yet the dominant advice seems to be completely change the entire approach. And so bringing it back to my point at the start of the presentation, that feels really unsatisfying to me. That I think contributes to the arbitrariness, if that's a word, of trying to understand how to draw a link between the problems you have and the solutions that are in the Turbo toolbox. So what I want is a way to keep that Turbo frame as the fundamental mechanic of how I do all my interactivity on the page. And I want to find just the minimal targeted bit of Turbo stream that is going to get me my extra redirect behavior. It's been in the back of my mind for a while. And then while I was researching for this talk, I found it in a blog post and the author of that blog post agreed with me and I felt validated. And I thought, now I'm confident enough to put it in my talk. I will publish that blog post after it. Actually, I'll put out some notes with this because it was really good. And we have a flash bug, so let's just refresh. We're going to use turbo streams. One neat thing you can do with turbo streams is you don't have to use their actions. I demonstrated replace before, but there's others that are mainly geared around DOM manipulation. I have just here defined my own turbo stream action called redirect. I've stuck it in my application.js. It just needs to be somewhere where it's going to get run when the page loads. This is where I set its name. And this is where I set what it does. In that context, this is going to have some stuff I can use. And I'm going to perform a turbo.visit. This turbo.visit is really the key of what's going on here. It tells Turbo to forget about any turbo frames. We're going to do a full page visit. It's going to appeal to Turbo Drive like we did originally with our first form. If I just stick this HTML after I've defined that, a turbo stream with action redirect, that's what I called it. And as my target, I say we're going to go to the profile I want to redirect to. As soon as Turbo just becomes aware of this HTML somewhere on the page or somewhere in a response or somewhere in a WebSocket, it's going to call turbo.visit and it's going to call turbo.visit on this target that I've specified. For me, what I wanted to do here is I have a controller. That's where I'm checking whether the profile is valid. I'm saving it to the database if it is. I'm rendering some validation errors if it's not. And then at the end, I've got my path I want to redirect to. If we're in HTML mode, I'm just going to do a straightforward redirect. We also have access to format.turbostream in our respond to blocks. That's how we know we're in a request response cycle that Turbo is paying attention to. And so Rails gives us this really nice helper to just execute a turbo stream action when that response hits the client. And so we can just execute my JavaScript that I defined, which is actually pretty neat. And I think starts to give you an insight into why writing JavaScript in HTML might be useful. I was just able to define this really small function, send it to my client, and then at any time I want to, anytime I know I need to in the server, I can just tell my client to do it. I don't have to do any surgical manipulations of the DOM based on IDs. I can just tell it this one general instruction. And that's how I think turbo streams should be used. I really don't enjoy doing DOM surgery with turbo streams. I think I'll expand on that in future slides. I won't labor it now. So let's see this thing actually work. I don't want to hit collisions, so I'm going to go around now. That's not mandatory. And we redirected away. We broke out of the turbo frame and we just redirected to a new page, but I didn't need to change the implementation of my turbo frame. That stuff got to stay the same. And it's only at the spot where I actually care about the logic of, I want to do a redirect, that I have to slightly change my technique. And I think that lessens some of the arbitrariness once you know that that's an option. By the way, interrupt at any point with questions if anyone wants some clarity on something. No? All right. Yeah, okay.
Have you considered of writing redirect to?
overriding redirect to, as in the controller.
Yeah, so you can watch.
Yeah.
And you can, if it's a turbo frame request, it attaches a header. Then you can know if it's actually request coming from the turbo frame, and if it's coming from the frame that are proper redirect, you just call it your old redirect.
I like that a lot. So perhaps it might look something like this: stick in an application controller so it's available in all of them. And let's assume there's some kind of method like this. There might not be. Yeah, right. Okay, cool. So something like this is viable. If so, I can do my implementation. Otherwise, I can call super. Great idea. I love this. I don't know whether I'd change the definition of redirect to in the work code base, but I think I'd do this in a side project. Or yeah, sure.
Yeah. Whereas the rest is just works. So that's why like you don't need any additional logic addition.
Yeah.
Just regress, and then it's always the same. It's from to the frame.
Yeah.
This way it's not.
I really like this idea. Thanks for proposing that. I would feel bad if a colleague was debugging something and they're like, why doesn't redirect to behave like redirect to? And I'd be like, well, I sort of overrode it in application controller tee. But that's true. It's not. All right, let's keep going. Let's do some more stuff with this form. Let's add a bit more interactivity. Validate on blur. That's a thing that lots of modern applications do. And we should be able to do it too. It's also another thing where people do DOM surgery with turbo streams, and I want to propose an alternative. This is getting a bit more, I don't know, a bit more out there, but I want to show that it is possible to start from a base of turbo frames and just iterate on that. So we don't have to rewrite it as a React SPA. I'm going to go through some code here. Don't write it down. It's more of a proof of concept. This sort of thing is possible and that this approach works. So what we're going to do is we're going to try and get validate on blur of an input, some real modern form interactivity. What if in the create method of our controller, where we go to save a record, we could do a sort of dry run. We could check if something is in our params, or maybe our headers. Actually kind of got inspiration from a library called unpoly, which puts this information in the headers. You can annotate your HTML in unpoly and it will put a validate header in there for you that you can check on the controller. I thought that was really cool, but we don't need to switch to unpoly to get it. So what I want to do is I want to check this validate flag, and if so, I want to just do a validation. And based on that, I might do success or 422, and then I'm just going to re-render the page because we don't actually want to do anything yet. We're relying on a little bit of client-side interaction, so I think it's a good time to define a stimulus controller. I'm just going to call it validator. It's responsible for making the form submit as a validation somehow. We're going to trigger it on blur. So when my text field expresses the blur event, we're going to look inside the validator stimulus controller, which we'll see just down here in a second, and we're going to call the validate method. And that's here. I'm not going to go through this code. I'm not sure if it's the best way to do it. I just wanted to use form.requestSubmit, and that's really the key thing. I want to submit that form subject to all its normal parameters, and I just want to make sure I've included in that form payload the key validate. And for good measure, I'm also going to stick the name of the field because who knows, that might become useful. Let's test it out. Well, that did validate on blur. And then it's good. And so on. So we've shown that validate on blur can work without having to do DOM surgery with turbo streams. But it's still a little unsatisfying because we validate it all at once. We don't want to have to validate all the fields at once because that's not what users expect. We could add a little bit more Ruby code, however. Instead of doing TurboStream surgery, what if we were to instead be more selective with how we build up the errors? I've just implemented some really crappy slideshow code. And what it does, it wants to look inside that information we pass through from the client to the server about what field was being validated. And what I really want out of it is a method on the model that I'm saving that lets me ask if a particular attribute is valid. I'm sure many people have implemented a variation of this method over the years. It's a useful thing. So I want to be able to ask the model, are you valid for this attribute? And I want to be able to pass in the name of the attribute whose input triggered the validation. And then I just want to render the result. I think I've elided some lines here, but you can project from the other one. This is terrible. Don't do this. Be clever about it, but I just wanted it to fit on 3 lines. And so just by selectively validating, even though our only point of front-end interaction is still just that turbo frame, we can have selective validate on blur. A few helper methods that are going to be useful time and time again, and that's all we need. I think that's much better from a maintenance perspective. I think it's easier to understand what's going on when you only need to read the Ruby. You don't need to sort of see a bunch of pieces implemented on the server and then imagine what's happening in the wilderness that is the client as they all come together and make up the user experience you want to deliver. So a solution with Turbo that satisfies me is one where everything's pretty much settled on the server before we hand it over to the client. Neat thing about that is it makes it a lot easier to test as well. You're actually standing a chance of testing this behavior in like a request spec or a system test, but using the rack test driver. It's got a bit of cleverness to handle Turbo, but it doesn't have the slowness of booting up Chrome. It lets you get a lot further with your unit, with your testing and testing of your view layer without having to start up a browser, and that's a beautiful thing. So I think this is a much nicer way to implement validate on blur. No questions? Cool. I want to take it one step further, and this is the last thing I'm going to show you tonight. I think we've achieved a lot of reactivity, a lot of interactivity on our form, and I think that's enough techniques. And this is really just validation on the previous step. Let's say we want to add some progressive disclosure. We want to change some field and we want something else to pop up. Again, we could handle this with some turbo streams. We could add our extra field, which is going to look like this, by sort of, I don't know, waiting for a specific blur event on birth date. And then we could maybe have a partial that just has the parental consent label and its radio buttons. And we could maybe respond with that. We could append it to the ID of the birth date field. I don't know. It feels like a lot. I don't want to do that. All I want to do is stick an enum on my model. I want to have a little helper that tells me whether the user is underage. And if they're underage, I want to make the presence of the parental consent field true. Then all I want to have to do is go to my template, ask, is this new profile underage? If yes, render a label and some radio buttons for my parental consent. That's all I should have to do. And because what's actually happening every time we blur is that we're refreshing that turbo frame, what we're really doing is just re-rendering the entire form based on the current state that makes sense. We're giving the Rails process all the information it needs to make a good, clean render, and we're just swapping that in. We've made it granular enough to isolate it to a section of the page where everything can change at once, but we haven't had to go so granular that we've made a flaky implementation that's going to break if we change an ID in a way that may be hard to catch outside of flaky system tests. So I think this is really neat. I think it's really, I'm just going to do it again because I want to see it. Actually, no, I can just change it, right? I can go, and then it's gone. Still got my validations. I've got my checking of whether my username is available. Super smooth. I didn't have to implement any custom JavaScript for that. It all just works. As I add more validations in my model, they're just going to pop up here. And all because we started with a turbo frame and then just added the minimum little bit of interactivity that we needed. I know I'm saying that a lot tonight, but that really is the thesis of the talk, and all these things are really just designed to demonstrate that that's possible. And I think that's everything I have to show you on that vein. So one more time.
I really love it. Like, have a look at place.
Thanks.
If you go back to that validation, if you go to the full name here,
Yeah.
press tab.
Good catch. I was wondering if someone would pick up on that.
Is there a way to they call it dom morphing library into turbo frames? So rather than
So I think there sure is. I think it's relatively recent that we got the ability to search. You can set it to morph. Get reloaded with morphing during page, and when they're explicitly reloaded. Something I ran into once. So I think I've added some JavaScript in there before to make the turbo frame swap happen with a morph. But yeah, I think if you want to be more careful about the state of your inputs, morphing is one way that you can go. I'd also be tempted to just somehow fix it with just a little bit of specific JavaScript to fix that problem. I found morphing to be really hard to predict. It's great. It's great when it works, but when it does something you don't expect, you can find yourself setting breakpoints in idiomorph in that one recursive function that goes node by node and steps down and does all the conditional branching, and that takes a while. So yeah, you still want to fix up those little client-side glitches with a little bit of tactical JavaScript. But I think what's still neat about this method is that you would be able to solve that once, and it wouldn't be something you have to take into account every time you build this thing out.
what was the problem there? Did it validate blank or did it lost the focus?
That it lost the focus.
Well, it did, and then it got replaced. Yeah. So you would be able to keep targeting. And there's also interesting challenge with the progressive disclosure because first tabs the JavaScript button. It really wanted it to land on
Oh, we didn't get a blur. Oh, right, duh. It didn't land on the button. So that's kind of good. But we wanted to land on this one.
also previous validation.
Correct. So that's could view that as a drawback. I kind of like it. If I've moved on like that, I think I've explicitly decided to take my focus away from it. When I did, I was thinking, is that a problem? Should I start trying to track the state? Should I include a hidden field to keep track of what fields have been validated so far? I thought, actually, no, like at that point, if I've moved on, I've moved on. I'm still going to get that final validation error at the end. So I decided to call that a feature rather than a bug. But if you feel like that's something that should be there, then you might want to have some way of keeping track of the state so that when you re-render, it's right there for you.
On this, can you choose which field to be available?
I don't think oh, sorry, which fields to do validation? Yeah. I defined an attribute valid method on the model, which I use here. I detect which input sent the blur event and read out its name, which is also something you would have to do if you were going to do like the turbo stream method. You would still need to know what input triggered it to know where to insert the errors. So instead of trying to use it to get back to a DOM element, I'm just using it to derive an attribute and selectively applying that validation to the attribute. So yeah, combination of a method on the model, which could also stick in application record, make it generic, replace this with self.class, and then it would be usable everywhere as well. Does that answer the question? Hey.
In that controller action where you would validate this, you would be initializing a new instance of profile with all the new parameters.
Correct.
So you already have an instance that you can introspect for errors. So you could do add profile dot errors, and I can't remember the APIs now, but there are APIs to look into the errors.
Yeah, that was the first thing I tried. And unfortunately, it doesn't. The errors objects is really interesting when you dig into it. It behaves like an enumerable. You can iterate over it, you can filter it, you can extract just the errors for the attribute you care about. I think I'd like that solution a little more. The trouble is what comes out is just plain arrays and hashes. And so it stops behaving. Well, the result of that is not another active model errors object, but rather just plain data that isn't necessarily going to be compatible with whatever you've built to render those errors. You might rely on being able to call like .full messages for. If I go into this project's a mess. Turns out it's really hard to have like 10 different versions of a form or with slightly different behavior. I should have known. But yeah, for example, on my new profile.errors, I like to call full messages for. But if I've done filtering on that full hash, then I lose the ability to have the methods like that are defined in the errors object. Whereas I've talked for a while, but is that actually what you meant?
Yeah, close. But yeah, I think I have to play with it a little bit to fully understand.
The object is this one.
Yeah.
And so it's got even more that's listed than is listed here, and it behaves like an enumerable, but it has these extra things that as soon as you start to do some filtering, you lose those extra methods. Maybe there's a way to do it, but I couldn't figure it out, so I went with what I found in a Stack Overflow thread.
The error version of pulling got all record collection. It converts it into an array.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, exactly like that. Yeah, when you sort of start applying Ruby methods to an active record query, and it suddenly stops being an active record query and actually gets materialized as data. Similar to that. Good correspondence. Yeah. Anyone else? Andrew.
Amazing tool.
Oh,
Like I have always been confused about the interaction between turbo frames, turbo streams, the whole lot, right? So I think you've done a really good job of putting a lot of content together.
thank you.
And an observation just from your initial part of the talk, I actually came across this the other day. It was that turbo drive gets kicked in immediately. And I stumbled over an issue the other day with hitting anchor tags within a page. Sometimes when you hit the anchor tag, it does a full refresh to find the right location, and sometimes it doesn't. And it turns out that it's turbo drive sometimes preloads it, sometimes doesn't. So an observation I came across the other day, but it was an observation that I hadn't put together with that I think we're talking about. So
Yeah, right.
thank you for
You got to know about these gotchas.
yeah, there's lots of little bits.
Yeah. There's been so much hype over Turbo. So many who say it'll solve all your problems. It's so easy and it'll solve every problem you have. I feel like those people must have really internalized all the gotchas and forgot about them, and are just living the easy life. Adam.
Trying to keep the lo-fi beats up.
Yeah.
Can you use permanent elements for that? I don't think I've ever actually attempted to implement it.
You can. Why didn't I do that? I tried. I think, yeah, so I think the reason I didn't go for it, you totally can. I think that's what it's for. But I don't like that it's sort of like opt-in. I think when you're sort of building a part of a page, particularly in the sort of component-oriented world we live in, you want to be able to just think of that portion of the page and not have to think about anything else. You want the interaction to only affect the thing that's in your mind right now. So, and I said it's opt-in, it's actually opt-out. Data turbo permanent sort of makes it so that the iframe has to opt out, so that you have to be aware of the iframe part of the page when you're working on the form, which is fine when it's only two things on the page. But if it's a complex page, you know, you don't want the things you do on one part to affect another. So that's why I don't think I used turbo permanent as the solution there. Feels like a stopping point. Thank you.